Caden Valesk Avrillon stood on the ramparts of Holmgrand and felt the stone crumbling beneath his boot. Fine limestone dust settled on the toe of his boot. He looked down. The fortress courtyard looked like a place where hope had died 20 years ago and no one had removed the body. 24 soldiers in rusty cuirasses were trying to form a square. Half of them were limping. One was leaning on the shaft of his spear as if it were a crutch. Another coughed so long that the formation broke every time he doubled over. The wind carried the smell of rotten straw and the cold river. Somewhere below, a gate creaked, clearly not closing all the way. Caden stood in silence. He had been brought here that morning under guard. 4 royal guards had escorted him to the gates of Holmgrand and turned back without saying a word. There hadn't even been a formal ceremony, just a sealed document and a statement from the captain of the escort stating that His Highness had been appointed to manage the Valenbrook estate by the will of the crown. To manage. Caden looked at the wall at his feet. A crack ran from the edge of a battlement down to the base. The masonry was dry. The mortar had been washed away by the rain so long ago that you could slip a finger between the stones. He crouched down and touched the joint. The stone gave way to his touch. Limestone. Local. A soft variety that lasts about 30 years without good mortar. These walls were over 50 years old. He straightened up and looked out at the courtyard again. The slope ran northward. After the rains, water flowed down toward the barracks and pooled there. The walls of the barracks below were dark with dampness. He could imagine what it smelled like inside. Mold, wet straw, sick people crammed together. The fortress gates faced a straight road. Any archer on the hill 300 paces away could shoot straight through the gate. No turns, no barbican. Just a hole in the wall with 2 gates that didn't close all the way. 2 thoughts coexisted in his mind. One was quiet and filled with tears. It told him that he had been cast out, that his father had said not to bring shame upon the family name, that his mother hadn't even come out to say goodbye, that his older brother Gareth had smiled when the decree was read aloud, that his middle brother Leonard had turned away toward the window, that he would die here, and that was exactly what they wanted. This thought belonged to Caden Valescu Avrillon, a 19-year-old prince without an army or friends. The second thought was calm, cold, familiar. It said that a dry limestone wall without mortar was a Class C disaster, that the courtyard's northward slope, with the barracks located at its lowest point, was a textbook example of how to wipe out a garrison without firing a single arrow. That a gate on a straight road wasn't even a mistake. It was simply laziness. That the well was situated lower down the slope than the outhouse, which meant people are drinking something they'd be better off not thinking about. This thought belonged to Kyle Hahn, a 27-year-old urban planning engineer from Seoul, a senior specialist in small-town revitalization, a man who died at a crosswalk on Friday evening because a drunk driver ran a red light. Kyle was carrying a thermos of coffee on his way to the night shift. He was submitting a project for the reconstruction of the Mokpo waterfront. His last thought was that the slope in the second quarter had been miscalculated. He didn't remember how the 2 memories had become one. It happened in a dream last night. Like 2 pieces of metal welded together. The seam was rough, but held. He was Caden, and he was Kyle. He was the prince who had been cast out to die, and the engineer who had rebuilt cities worse than this one 20 times over. And right now, the engineer was winning. Caden silently mouthed words that made no sense to anyone in this world. He said that he was Kyle Hahn, that he'd done this 20 times, that the materials here were simply different, and at that moment, A golden grid unfolded before his eyes. A translucent lattice lay over the world like a blueprint over a photograph. He saw lines. The perfect lines of the walls that were supposed to stand here. The lines of the roads. The lines of the drainage. The lines of the waterways. Each glowed with a soft golden light, and each did not match what had actually been built. The discrepancy was monstrous. The walls weren't where they should be. The road didn't go that way. The well wasn't in the right spot. The barracks weren't supposed to be here at all. He blinked. The grid hadn't disappeared. He turned his head. The grid turned with his gaze. He looked at the soldiers in the courtyard and saw faint, flickering labels above them. Something like a tag hung above the limping spearman. Former carpenter, right knee shattered. Drinks to numb the pain. Another label hung over the coughing man. Baker's son, weak lungs since childhood, afraid of dying without a name. Caden swallowed hard. This was impossible. It looked like an interface, like the work program he opened every day at his office in Seoul. Only instead of a screen, it was the whole world. And instead of data on pipes and soil, there was data on people and stones and water and wind. He stood on the wall for a long time. The sun shifted. The shadows changed angle. The soldiers below dispersed. Someone brought him water and bread and set them on a rock nearby without saying a word. He didn't touch the food. He looked at the city, at Holmgrand, at the winding streets, at the sagging roofs, at the walls that stood by force of habit rather than mortar. And the golden grid showed him, above it all, another city. A city that could stand here, a city that was meant to stand here. The right one. Alive. Real. A man in a worn officer's coat appeared below, broad-shouldered, gray-haired, with a face that looked as if it had been carved from old wood and forgotten to be sanded down. A label hung over him. Captain of the Guard, 32 years of service. Drinks out of guilt. He'd buried more people than he could remember by name. The captain raised his head and looked at Caden. Their eyes met. Caden saw in that gaze what he'd seen in the eyes of officials in small Korean towns that were dying a slow death. Weariness. Not malicious, just very old. The captain looked away first and walked off. Caden remained on the wall. He looked at the crack beneath his feet, then at the courtyard with its uneven slope, then at the gate that wouldn't close, then at the barracks where people were sick because, in 50 years, no one had thought about where the water was flowing. He quietly told himself that this could be fixed, that it was just a poorly designed city, that he'd seen worse, that in Mokpo, the embankment had been in such a state that he hadn't slept for 3 nights when he saw the calculations. And so what? He did it. He delivered. The embankment still stands. The wind blew again and carried the scent of the river. Cold, clean from a distance. Caden sat up straight. He wasn't crying anymore. The prince inside him was still trembling, but the engineer was already doing the math. On the second morning, Caden went down to the courtyard before dawn. He hadn't slept almost all night. The room he'd been assigned was in the upper tower of the fortress. The ceiling was leaking in 2 places. The bed stood directly beneath one of the leaks, and the sheet was damp. He moved the bed against the wall and lay down on the dry half. Then he lay there, staring into the darkness and listening to the water drip. The rhythm was irregular. The roof had sagged on the eastern side, and water was pooling at a single point. He could fix it in a day if he had tar and boards, but first, there was something more important. In the morning, he walked from the barracks to the well, then from the well to the outhouse behind the eastern wall, then back to the barracks. A golden grid hung before his eyes and showed him everything: the slope, The direction of the runoff, groundwater. He saw how rainwater ran across the courtyard toward the barracks and stood there for weeks. He saw how it seeped into the ground and mixed with what flowed from the outhouse. He saw how that water ended up in the well. People were drinking poison every day for years. The fever in the garrison wasn't a curse, it was the sewage system, or rather, the complete lack thereof. Caden returned to the barracks. He picked up a bucket of lime that was standing against the wall. He found a piece of charcoal. He went out into the courtyard and began drawing a line directly on the ground. The line ran from the barracks away from the well. It curved around the corner of the wall. It led toward an old ravine on the southern side of the fortress. He drew slowly and precisely. The grid helped him trace the perfect line. He adjusted it to match the actual terrain. Here was a rock. Here was soft soil. Here was the root of an old tree that he'd have to go around. By the time he finished the line, people were already standing in the courtyard. 4 soldiers, 2 stable hands, an old woman who cooked porridge for the garrison. They were watching the prince as he crawled on the ground with charcoal in his hands, drawing curved lines. One of the soldiers quietly said to another that the prince must have lost his mind on the road. Caden sat up straight. Mud covered his knees, palms, and face. He looked at the soldiers and told them to dig here, along this line, knee-deep, a palm's width, by this evening. No one moved. The soldier who'd spoken of madness turned away. The other spat. The stable hand scratched the back of his neck and walked over to the horses. Caden stood there for a second. Then he took off his doublet. He threw it onto a rock. He rolled up his shirt sleeves. He picked the shovel leaning against the barracks wall, and he began to dig. The first meter was hard work. The soil was compacted and hard from decades of use. The shovel was blunt. Caden's hands were those of a prince, not a laborer. 20 minutes later, everything from his shoulders to his lower back ached. After 40 minutes, the first blisters burst on his palms. He didn't stop. He dug in a straight line, maintaining the exact depth. The grid hung before his eyes, showing the required slope, 2 degrees, enough for the water to flow on its own. An hour later, a young soldier approached him, the one with the bad lungs, the son of a Karya. He didn't say a word. He just grabbed a second shovel and started digging beside him. An hour and a half later, there were 4 of them digging. 3 hours later, 8. By noon, one of the soldiers had brought more shovels from the armory. No one asked why. They simply saw that the prince was digging, that he hadn't stopped, that there was blood on his palms, yet he kept digging. By evening, 30 people were working. The ditch ran from the barracks across the courtyard, past the well, to the southern ravine. Caden himself filled the bottom with rubble he'd found in the ruins of an old stable. The rubble was large and uneven, but it would do for the first layer. He arranged the stones so that water would flow through, but the soil wouldn't erode. The basic principle of drainage. First lesson. It rained that night. Caden stood under the awning by the barracks and watched. Water flowed across the courtyard as usual. It reached the ditch and flowed away, not toward the barracks, not toward the well, into the ravine, exactly where he'd calculated it would go. Captain Bran was standing nearby. He'd come without a word. He stood beside him. He watched the water. It rained all night, and in the morning the courtyard by the barracks was dry for the first time in years. Bran looked at the dry ground by the barracks wall, then at the ditch, then at Caden. 3 days later, Caden ordered the soldiers to move the outhouse. It had previously been located higher up the slope, above the well. He had it moved lower down, behind the southern wall, with a drainage channel leading into the same ravine, but through a separate ditch. The soldiers grumbled, but dug. They had already seen that the first ditch was working. A week later, the fever in the garrison began to subside. Those who had been seriously ill were still bedridden, but there were no new cases. The garrison's medic, an old drunkard named Gunther, went from bed to bed and couldn't figure out what had changed. He muttered about blessings and a change in the wind. Caden didn't correct him. On the 5th day, Captain Bran came to see him in the tower. Caden was sitting on the floor because the table was wobbly and it was impossible to draw on it. In front of him lay a sheet of rough paper. On the sheet was a plan of the fortress courtyard. A real plan. With dimensions, with elevation marks, with the direction of the slopes. Bran looked at the drawing, then at the prince sitting on the floor with charcoal between his fingers. He asked what Caden was doing. Caden raised his head. He wiped the dirt from his forehead with the back of his hand. He smeared it around even more. And he replied that he was the one who'd noticed that they were relieving themselves higher up the slope from where they drank water, and that everything else was just arithmetic. Bran was silent for a long time. Then he sat down on the floor beside him. His knees creaked. He looked at the drawing again. He asked what else needed to be dug. Caden pointed out the next line on the plan, the drainage channel from the north wall. If it wasn't built by fall, the wall would collapse. Bran nodded. He stood up. He left. In the morning, 20 soldiers were standing in the courtyard with shovels, without an order. Bran simply told them that the prince knew where to dig. And they came. Not because they trusted the prince, but because their comrades had stopped getting sick after he last told them where to dig. Caden went out to them. His hands were wrapped in rags over his calluses. He unfolded the blueprint. He pointed to the line. He was the first to pick up a shovel, and he began to dig. By the end of the 2nd week, the courtyard of Holmgrand had changed. Ditches carried away the water. The outhouse was in the right place. The well provided clean water. The walls of the barracks had dried out, and 32 of the 40 soldiers were still on their feet. Caden watched it all from the fortress wall. A golden haze shimmered before his eyes. The gap between the ideal and reality had narrowed slightly, just a little, by 1%, maybe 2. But that percentage meant that 8 people who were supposed to die this fall would live. In the 3rd week, Caden stepped outside the fortress walls for the first time and walked through the city. Holmgrand was not a city, but a monument to neglect. The main street ran from the fortress gate to the market square. It was about 400 paces long. It had once been paved. Stones remained in places. Grass grew between them, and the mud reached up to the ankles. The houses along the street were wooden. The bottom beams had rotted away on every other one. The roofs had sagged. Shutters hung by a single hinge or were missing entirely. There were almost no people on the street. Those he did encounter averted their eyes. Caden walked and observed. The grid showed him everything, where the street should run, where the slope for water drainage should be, where the houses stood that wouldn't survive the coming winter. Markers flickered above the people. Widow, 3 children, afraid to leave the house after dark. Carpenter. His hands are intact. He's been out of work for 3 years. A baker. His oven cracked. He bakes for others in exchange for a share. Bran followed behind him, silently. Caden hadn't asked him to come. Bran had come on his own. They reached the market square. The square was empty. 3 stalls. One sold turnips. The second, old fish. The third stood empty. Caden stopped in the middle of the square and slowly turned around. The grid superimposed another square over this desolation, with proper drainage, with stalls arranged so that streams of people wouldn't cause a crush, with streetlights spaced precisely to provide adequate lighting, with awnings over the market stalls to shelter from the rain. He saw it so clearly that for a second he forgot where he was. Bran coughed behind him. Caden snapped back to reality. He asked Bran how many people lived in the city. Bran replied that no one had ever counted exactly. Maybe 400, maybe fewer. There had been more than 1,000 under the old Margrave. People had fled, some to the west, some simply into the forest. Caden nodded. He asked about the town elder. Bran grimaced. He said the mayor was Mads Olbricht, that he was still in office, that he was always in office, that he had been there under the previous Margrave and would be there under the next one, and the one after that. Bran didn't say the mayor was a thief. He didn't say it with words, but his face said enough. Caden walked toward the mayor's house. Olbricht's house was the only one in town with an intact roof and glass in the windows. Caden noted this. Glass in Holmgrand was more expensive than silver. The mayor had 4 windows. Mads Olbricht met him at the door, a stout man in his 50s with soft hands and attentive eyes. He bowed exactly as low as protocol required, not a hair's breadth lower. He addressed Caden as Your Highness. He invited him in. He offered him wine. Caden entered. He declined the wine. He sat down in a chair and asked to see the town's ledgers. Olbricht smiled. He said the ledgers were in order, that he would send copies to the fortress. Caden said he wanted to see the originals, right away. Olbricht's smile didn't change, but his eyes grew slightly colder. He brought the ledgers, 3 thick volumes. Caden opened the first one. Numbers, grain receipts, garrison expenses, taxes, repairs. He read quickly. Kyle Khan had worked with municipal budgets for 8 years. He knew what honest numbers looked like, and he knew what dishonest ones looked like. Olbricht's numbers were dishonest. Neatly, professional, neat, but dishonest. Grain was received in one quantity, but recorded as another. The difference was small, 2 or 3%. Over the course of a year, that added up to a lot. Over 10 years, it amounted to a fortune. Caden closed the book. He looked at Olbricht. Olbricht looked at him with the expression of a man who'd been playing this game for 30 years and wasn't afraid of a kid. Caden didn't accuse him. He said he needed an inventory of the warehouses, a real one, that he'd send his man tomorrow. Olbricht asked which man. Caden didn't know yet, but he saw something. When he entered the foyer, he noticed a shadow in the far corner of the hallway, small, quiet. A girl in a simple dress holding a book. The scanner showed him the tag. The mayor's daughter. 17 years old. She can count faster than the treasurer. Her father despises her for being useless. Caden left the mayor's house. He stopped on the street. He turned to Bran and said he needed people to work on the main street, to pave it, lay drainage, to install streetlights. Bran asked what kind of people. Soldiers aren't masons. Caden said he needed townspeople, that he would pay them. Bran asked with what. The Mark's treasury was empty. Caden replied that he didn't know yet, but that the work would begin in 3 days. He returned to the fortress. He climbed up to the tower. He sat down on the floor. He unfolded a new sheet of paper, and he began to sketch a plan of the main street. Every house, every paving stone, every slope for water drainage, every lamp post with the distance for lighting calculated. He worked until dark. Then he lit a candle and worked some more. The grid glowed gold before his eyes. The lines fell onto the paper one after another. By dawn, the plan was ready. 400 paces of street, 42 lamp posts, 12 drainage grates, 6 places where the bottom courses of the houses needed to be replaced, 2 places where it would be easier to tear down the house and rebuild it, 1 spot where a wall needed to be moved half a meter to the left so the street could breathe. He looked at the plan and knew it was a good one. Not perfect. The grid showed the ideal, but good, workable. The kind that could be built by the hands of the people who were here. The problem was that the people who lived here didn't believe anyone would actually build it. They'd seen margraves and princes come and go. They'd heard the promises. They'd seen them leave or die. They'd learned not to believe, and Caden knew that a plan on paper wouldn't change that. Only a built street would. He stood up. He stretched his back. His hands ached from calluses. He stepped out onto the wall and looked down at the city in the morning light. Smoke from the chimneys. Thin, faint. Not enough firewood. Another problem to add to the list. He sighed. The list was growing faster than his ability to cross items off it. But that was normal. In Mokpo, the list had also grown during the first 3 months. Then it started to shrink. It would be the same here, if he survived. The payment issue was resolved more easily than Caden had thought. On the second day after his tour of the city, he went down into the fortress's basements. Bran had said there was nothing there but rats and old junk. Bran was wrong. The basements of Holmgrand were enormous. The old fortress had been built as a key hub of the Margraviate, and beneath it were storage rooms extending 3 levels down. The top 2 were littered with rotten wood and broken roof tiles. The third was locked. The lock was completely rusted through. Caden knocked it open with a stone. Beyond the door lay darkness. He stepped inside with his torch. The room was dry. This surprised him. Everything in Holmgrand was damp, but here the walls were built of a different kind of stone, darker, denser. The grid before his eyes flashed brighter than usual. The lines became sharper. He sensed a strange hum, not a sound, more like a vibration in his bones. He didn't understand what it was and didn't linger, because on the shelves along the walls lay what he needed right now. Tools. Old, but made of good metal. Chisels, wedges, staples, 3 barrels of nails. And in the far corner, under an oil-stained cloth, stood boxes containing something heavy. He opened them. Copper. Copper ingots. Not much, 20 pieces, but for Holmgrand, that was money. When Bran saw the copper, he whistled. He said the old Margrave had apparently been hiding a stash in case of a siege and had forgotten about it, or hadn't had time to mention it before he died. Caden divided up the copper. 5 ingots to pay for the work on the street, 3 to buy lime and mortar, 2 for food for the workers. He kept 10 in reserve. He went out into the city and announced that he was paying for the work, with copper, by weight, for every day of paving the street, for every meter of ditch, for every lamp post installed. The first to arrive were those who had nothing to lose. An unemployed carpenter he'd seen on the street, 2 young men from the outlying farmsteads, an old man who'd been laying stone for 40 years and was willing to work for food. By the end of the first day, Caden had 12 workers. He stood before them, unfolded the plan, pointed out the first section, 20 paces from the fortress gate down the street. Paving. Drainage along the edges. He showed them how to lay the stones, which side up, what slope to give for water runoff. He demonstrated with his hands. He picked up a stone himself and laid it down himself. He checked the level himself. He didn't have a level. He made one out of a board and a rope with a weight, the simplest plumb line. They worked for 7 days. Caden worked alongside them every day, from dawn until dark. His hands were covered with a crust of calluses on top of old calluses. His back ached so much that he'd fall asleep in the same position he'd gone to bed in and wake up in it too. But 20 paces of the street were paved, even, clean, with a drainage system that worked. When it rained on the 8th day, the water drained from the pavement in a minute. The old mason stood and watched. He had laid thousands of stones in his life, but never according to a plan like this. He said the stone lay as if it were alive. Caden didn't bother to explain that the stone was laid according to a calculated slope with a tolerance of 1/2 degree. He simply nodded. On the 10th day, A woman came to him, tall, broad-shouldered. Her hands bore old burn scars. Her braid was tucked under a scarf to protect it from sparks. Ingrid Halden, a blacksmith, the only working smithy in Holmgrand. She hadn't come to apply for a job. She'd come to ask who made such staples. At first, Caden didn't understand. Then he did. She had seen the staples he used to secure the cobblestones. Simple iron staples, but with a lock. Kyle Hahn had seen ones like them in Japan. The tail of the staple was bent in a special way, so that when the stone settled, the lock tightened rather than loosened. A simple solution. Elegant, and completely unknown in this world. Caden said he'd invented the clamps himself. Ingrid looked at him the way a blacksmith looks at someone else's work, with a professional interest that's impossible to fake. She said the lock was good, but the metal was poor, soft iron. It'll fall apart by the second winter. Caden knew she was right. He asked if she could make a better one. Ingrid snorted. She said she could make it out of steel if the prince had enough money for coal. Caden invited her to the fortress. They went up to the tower. He unfolded a drawing in front of her. Not brackets for the bridge, a different blueprint. Brackets for the walls, with a triple lock, with load calculations, allowing for seasonal expansion of the stone. Ingrid stared at the blueprint in silence for a long time. Her burn-scarred fingers slowly traced the lines. She asked how he knew all this. Caden said he'd studied for a long time. Ingrid lifted her head. There was something strange in her eyes, something he didn't recognize at first. Then he understood. Recognition. She saw a signature in this drawing, not that of a specific person, but the signature of a master who thinks like a blacksmith, who understands that metal isn't infinitely patient, who allows for a margin of error not out of fear, but out of respect for the material. Her father used to draw like that. She said she'd make a trial batch, for free, to see how it turned out. Then they'd talk about the price. She left. That night, Caden fell asleep faster than usual, not because the pain had lessened. It hurt just as much. But something had shifted. He'd found a blacksmith. In a city where nothing worked, he'd found a man whose hands could make what his mind imagined. The next day, Ingrid sent 3 brackets along with an apprentice. He took one. He turned it over in his hands. Steel. The lock was perfect. The tolerances were precise. He inserted the bracket into the wall at the test site. It fit like a glove. He looked at the wall. The grid flickered. The alignment shifted slightly toward perfection, just a little. But he saw it, and he smiled. For the first time in 3 weeks in Holmgrand. By the end of the first month, a third of the main street had been restored. 40 paces of paving, drainage, 6 lampposts. Caden lit them himself. Oil lamps spaced at regular intervals. Each illuminated a circle of 12 paces. The circles overlapped by a third, not a single dark spot. In the evening, people came out onto the street, just to look. Children ran along the clean pavement. An old market vendor carried a basket and stopped under a lamppost. She looked up at the light, then down at the stones, then from side to side. She didn't say a word, she just kept walking. But she walked down the middle of the street, on the clean stone. For the first time in many years, she didn't have to hug the walls and avoid the mud. Caden watched this from the tower window. The grid glowed gold, and he thought that this was what it was all for. For the old woman walking down the middle of the street without a thought for the mud. For this, it was worth digging ditches and working his hands to the bone. In the 5th week, Caden went after Mila Olbricht. He'd been thinking about it ever since the day he saw her shadow in the hallway of his father's house. The grid showed him the mark. It counts faster than the treasurer. That wasn't a metaphor. Caden had checked. He left the ledgers on the table in the fortress and asked Bran to invite the village headman's daughter in for a talk. Bran looked at him strangely, but did as he was told. Mila arrived 2 hours later. Quiet, petite, in a simple dress. Mountain crystal glasses perched on her nose, a rare sight in these parts. She stood by the door and didn't come in. Caden was sitting on the floor next to the blueprints. He motioned for her to sit down. She sat. He asked if she had read her father's ledgers. Mila turned pale. He saw her fingers clench the hem of her dress. She said nothing. Caden picked up a book from the table. He opened it to the page with the grain records. He placed it in front of her. He said he could see pencil marks in the margins, that the handwriting wasn't her father's, that the notes corrected the totals, that the corrections were accurate. Mila sat motionless. She stared at the book and said nothing. Caden said she'd known for 3 months that her father was stealing grain. He asked why she'd kept quiet. Mila looked up at him. Her eyes were filled with fear, not for herself, for her father. She said quietly that there was no one to tell. Caden nodded. He said he didn't want her father in prison, that he needed honest inventory records, that she would start working for the city tomorrow, that her salary would be that of a captain of the guard. Mila looked at him and couldn't say a word. No one in her life had ever said such things to her. Her father used to say she was good for nothing, that she could at least be pretty enough to make a good marriage, that books and numbers weren't a woman's business. And here sat a prince whom everyone considered mad, sitting on the floor next to the blueprints, and offering her a job because of her ability to count. She said her father wouldn't allow it. Caden replied that he wasn't asking her father, he was asking her. Mila was silent for a moment. Then she quietly said she'd come tomorrow. She came, at dawn, with her own book and 2 pencils. Caden seated her in a room next to his. He gave her all the fortress's accounting records, warehouses, supplies, expenses, weapons, provisions. He said he needed the full picture, what was available, what was missing, what was being wasted, and how long the supplies would last at the current rate of consumption. Mila worked for 3 days without looking up. On the 4th day, she brought him the report. Caden read it and felt a chill spread through him. Grain supplies would last 2 months, firewood 1.5 months. There was no iron at all for repairing the walls. There was exactly enough silver in the treasury to pay the soldiers for 1 month. After that, nothing. Mila stood before him and waited. He looked up and told her she'd done an excellent job, that the numbers were bad, but her work was excellent. Mila blushed slightly. It was the first time anyone had praised her for what she was good at. Meanwhile, the news that the village headman's daughter was working for the prince reached Olbricht quickly. He came to the fortress that very same day. Polite, smiling, with wine, which Caden once again declined. Olbricht said that his daughter was still a child, that she didn't understand business matters, that he could provide his own person to handle the accounting, someone experienced, reliable. Caden looked at him and said that Mila would stay, that she understood business matters better than her father thought, and that if the village head had any complaints about the fortress's accounting, he could set them out in writing, and Mila would review them. The smile faded from Olbricht's face for a second. For just a second. Then the smile returned. He bowed and left. Caden knew he'd made an enemy, not a deadly one. Not yet, anyway. Olbricht was a thief, but not a fool. He would wait and watch as long as the prince remained useful, or until the prince made a mistake. Meanwhile, work on the street continued. The number of workers had grown to 20. The pavement was taking shape. Caden kept track of every single stone. Every evening he walked around the site and checked it. The slope, leveling, drainage. If something was wrong, he didn't yell. He would get down on his knees and demonstrate. He'd pick up a stone and turn it over. He'd explain. At first, the men got angry. Then they got used to it. Then they started checking things themselves. An old stonemason taught the young ones how to lay stones plumb. Caden saw this and realized that the process was beginning to take on a life of its own. That people were learning. That knowledge was being passed on. By the end of the 6th week, the main street was ready. 400 paces from the fortress gate to the market square. Paving, drainage, 42 lampposts. Caden lit the last lantern himself. He stood at the edge of the square and looked back. The street glowed. A smooth strip of warm, oily light stretched from the gate to the square. People stood along the walls and watched, in silence. Caden spotted Ingrid among them. She stood with her arms crossed over her chest. Her face bore the expression he'd seen on the faces of master craftsmen when they looked at someone else's work and couldn't find anything to criticize. Mila stood next to her, a book pressed to her chest. Her glasses reflected the light from the street lamps. She was smiling, quietly, almost imperceptibly, but she was smiling. Bran stood at the fortress gate, upright, hands behind his back. His face was expressionless, but he hadn't left. He stood there, looking out at the street like a man who had served for 32 years in a place where nothing ever changed for the better. And now, it had changed. The grid before Caden's eyes flickered. The match with the ideal in this section had reached 60%. Not resonance yet. Resonance requires 80. But the street was alive. People were walking along it. There was no mud on it. The street lights were on. The water was draining where it should. Caden quietly thought that if this had been his project in Mokfo, the boss would have said the pace was good, but the documentation was lacking. And he would have been right. The documentation really was lacking. But there was no boss here. Here was Bran, who didn't know what documentation was, and Mila, who was just starting to learn, and Ingrid, who understood blueprints better than words, and 400 people who were looking at the brightly lit street and, for the first time in a long while, thinking that maybe things weren't so bad after all. Maybe this strange prince, who digs ditches with his own hands and sits on the floor with the blueprints, knows something that those who came before him didn't. Caden didn't know if they knew it, but he knew that the street was standing, and that tomorrow he would begin work on the market square. Because a city isn't just one street. A city is a system. And the system was just getting started. The market square took the entire 2nd month. Caden began by walking around it for 3 days with a string and stakes. He measured every angle, every slope, every distance between the old stalls. The grid showed the ideal, but the ideal had to be translated into a plan that people without an engineering background could understand. He drew on the ground with chalk. This is where the rows will be, 3 rows of counters. Between them, aisles 4 steps wide, not 3, not 5, 4. Because with 3, children get crushed in the crowd. With 5, shoppers lose the market feel and walk right past. 4 steps is the distance at which a person can see the goods on both the left and right at the same time, while still carrying a basket without bumping into others. An old bricklayer asked how the prince knew such things. Caden replied that he had read books. That was half true. He had read books at Seoul National University in the urban planning program. He designed the square's drainage system differently than on the street. The square was large and flat. Water would pool there after every rain. He created a barely noticeable slope from the center toward the edges, 2 degrees, imperceptible to the eye, but enough for the water to flow toward the drainage ditches along the perimeter. The ditches led to the same southern ravine. The system was self-contained. He added awnings, simple wooden structures on posts, above each row of counters. He calculated the roof's angle so that rain would flow into the ditches rather than onto the merchandise or the people. Ingrid made steel brackets for the awnings with her lock. Caden showed her the mounting diagram, and she nodded silently. Then she said the lock was good, but the support post needed to be thicker. He asked why. She said that the wind here blows from the north in winter and would uproot a thin support post by spring. Caden looked at his drawing. She was right. He hadn't accounted for the wind load at this latitude. In Mokpo, the wind came from the sea and was different. He corrected the drawing right in front of her. Ingrid watched as he did the calculations. Her eyes narrowed. She asked what the symbols were that he was writing next to the numbers. Caden froze. He'd written them out of habit, Korean unit symbols. He said it was his personal notation system. A personal one. Ingrid snorted and didn't ask any further. But she remembered. In the third week of work on the square, what Caden had been waiting for happened. A temple servant arrived, the only representative of the Temple of Measure in the district, a small, gaunt man named Gustav, with a shaved head and a chain around his neck bearing the symbol of measure, a square and a plumb line. Gustav came to the square and stood there for 2 hours. He watched. Then he left. That evening, Bran told Caden that Gustav writes a report to the capital every week, that the prince is building without the temple's blessing, that the lines are being laid without a ritual, that it is heresy. Caden asked Bran how long Gustav had been in Holmgrand. Bran said 12 years. Caden asked what Gustav had built in those 12 years. Bran remained silent. The answer was obvious. Nothing. Gustav hadn't built anything. Gustav made sure no one else built anything without permission. And since no permits came from the temple, because the brand was cursed, and it was in the temple's interest for it to remain cursed, nothing was built. 12 years. Caden went back to work. The square was growing. In the 4th week, he set up the stalls. Not temporary planks on trestles, stone bases with wooden countertops. The height was chosen so that the merchant wouldn't have to hunch over. The width was such that the merchandise was visible but wouldn't fall off. Each stall stood in its designated spot according to the plan, not by eye, according to the plan. When the market square was ready, Caden did something no one expected. He abolished the market entrance fee. Under the old Margrave, every merchant paid for a spot. Ulbricht collected the money. Half went to the treasury, half stayed with Ulbricht. Everyone knew this, and everyone kept quiet. Caden announced that the market was free. Spaces are free. Come and trade. Ulbricht arrived an hour later, without a smile. He said the treasury would lose revenue, that maintaining the market costs money. Caden said that while the treasury would lose revenue from the entrance fee, it would gain revenue from the sales tax. That revenue would be less per merchant, but there would be more merchants. Because free admission would attract people from the surrounding villages. Because a square with awnings and good paving is a place people want to visit. Ulbricht objected that the tax would have to be calculated and collected. Caden said that Mila would handle it. Ulbricht fell silent. His daughter had been working for the prince for a month already. Ulbricht had seen her leave in the morning and return in the evening. He'd seen how she'd started to speak with more confidence, how she'd stopped lowering her eyes at the table. That annoyed him more than the loss of money. The market opened on the first day of the 3rd month. Caden didn't give any speeches. He simply opened the square that morning. 4 merchants came from the city: turnips, fish, pots, honey. By noon, a wagon pulled up from a village 20 versts to the west. Flour and wool. The merchant said he'd heard about the new market square from a traveler, that the road was bad, but the market square was worth it. The road. Caden made a mental note. The next road. By the end of the first week of the market, there were 12 merchants. The square wasn't full, but it was alive. People walked between the rows. Children ran about. An old woman merchant, who used to carry a basket down a muddy street, now stood behind a counter under an awning, selling dried herbs. It started to rain. The water drained from the square in 5 minutes. The goods under the awnings remained dry. The old woman looked at the dry goods, then at the sky. Then she quietly crossed herself. Caden saw this from the tower window. The grid before his eyes showed that the match in the square had reached 75%. Close to resonance. Very close. He was missing just a little something, but he didn't yet know exactly what. That same evening, Bran arrived. He sat down on the floor next to Caden. He said that Calthar scouts had been spotted at the southeastern outpost. 3 horsemen. They rode up to the border of the Margraviate, took a look, and rode away. Caden looked up from his drawing. He asked when this had happened. Bran said 3 days ago. Caden asked why he was only being told now. Bran shrugged. He said that the Caltharians rode through here every month, that under the old Margrave they rode as if it were their own backyard, that no one paid any attention. Caden put down his pencil. He looked at Bran. He said that from this day forward, every appearance of foreign horsemen on the Margraviate's territory must be reported to him on the same day. That he needed the patrol routes. That he needed a map of the outposts and observation posts. That he needed to know how many men he could station on the walls if 100 Caltharian horsemen appeared outside Holmgrand tomorrow morning. Bran sat up straight. For the first time ever, Caden saw in him not a weary old man, but an officer. Bran said he could station 35 men on the walls. 12 of them were archers. The rest were armed with spears and shields. The walls were in poor condition. The gates didn't close completely. They had enough arrows for 2 hours of battle. Caden nodded. He knew all this, but he needed Bran to say it out loud. He needed Bran to hear his own words. He needed him to understand that the market and the streetlights were all well and good, but without walls, it would all be over by the first assault. Bran understood. He left. In the morning, Caden began working on a plan to reinforce the walls. The walls were the main problem. Caden had known this from day one. He'd walked the entire perimeter of Holmgrand in 2 days. The grid showed him every crack, every weak joint, every spot where the masonry had sagged or shifted. Of the 800 paces along the perimeter, 300 were in critical condition. The wall could collapse in a strong wind. Another 200 paces were in poor condition. They were holding, but wouldn't withstand a battering ram. Only 300 paces on the western side were still suitable for defense, and that was only because the western wall stood on a rocky foundation that prevented subsidence. Caden sat in the tower, poring over the blueprints, and spent 3 days calculating. He couldn't repair all the walls at once. There weren't enough people. There wasn't enough stone. There wasn't enough mortar. There wasn't enough time. He had to choose. What to repair first, what to leave for later, what to abandon altogether. The grid showed the ideal. Double walls along the entire perimeter, a barbican at the gate, and towers at the corners. A moat on the north side. Caden looked at the ideal and realized it would take 2 years of working at full capacity to achieve it. He didn't have 2 years. Calthar scouts had seen that Holmgrand was under construction. They would return. And next time, there wouldn't be just 3 horsemen. He did what he always did when a project was too big for his resources. He set priorities. First, the gate. Repair the gate leaves, build the barbican. Simple. 2 walls at an angle in front of the gate so that a straight path could no longer be fired through the gate opening. Second, the northern wall. The weakest, the longest, the most dangerous. Don't repair the old one. Build a new one 10 paces in front of it. Leave the inner wall as is. This will create a double wall with a passage between them. If the enemy breaks through the outer wall, they'll find themselves in a narrow corridor under fire from the inside. Third, a moat. Not along the entire perimeter, only on the north and east sides, where the approach is gentle and suitable for siege engines. He showed the plan to Bran. Bran looked at it for a long time. Then he said that the idea of a double wall was good, but there was no stone. The old quarries 10 versts to the north were abandoned. The road is in ruins. Carts won't make it through. Caden said they'd repair the road, that they'd reopen the quarry, that he needed people, not soldiers, but townspeople and peasants, those who knew how to work with stone and earth. Bran asked who would go. The work is hard and dangerous, on the border, where the Caltharians roam as if they own the place. Caden said that those he pays would go, and those he protects. He divided the garrison. 20 men remained in the fortress. 15 set out with the caravan for the quarry. Bran led them personally. Caden stayed in the city. He hired 30 townspeople to build the barbican. He paid them in copper. Supplies were dwindling. Mila showed him the figures every evening. The copper would last 6 weeks. After that, they'd need a new source of income. The market yielded very little. The sales tax brought in copper coins, but there weren't enough copper coins for a construction project of this scale. Caden thought. He calculated. He searched for a solution. The solution came from Ingrid. She came to him on the evening of the 5th day of work on the barbican. She said that merchants from the west wanted to buy the lock fasteners she was making for his walls. That one merchant had seen a bracket at the market and asked the price, that he was willing to pay in silver. Caden looked at her. Ingrid was standing in the doorway. Her hands were covered in soot. Her apron was scorched in 3 places. She wasn't smiling. She was talking business. Caden asked how many staples she could make in a day. Ingrid said 10, 15 if an apprentice helped. Caden asked how much a single staple cost on the open market. Ingrid named the price. Caden did the math in his head. 15 staples a day at that price. That's silver, not copper. Silver. If they could set up a supply chain through the market, it would cover the construction costs. He told Ingrid that she was no longer just a blacksmith on contract, that she was the head of production, that he needed a workshop, not just one forge, a workshop, 3 furnaces, 6 blacksmiths, quality standards, quality control on every batch. Ingrid looked at him and said nothing. Then she said quietly that she didn't have 6 blacksmiths, that there was only one blacksmith left in Holmgrand besides her, an old man, half blind. His hands still work, but his eyes don't anymore. Caden said he'd find blacksmiths, that they'd come, that Ingrid Halden's stirrup would be famous throughout the entire eastern border within a year. Ingrid snorted. She said the prince was a dreamer, but her eyes sparkled. He saw it. He knew that sparkle. That's how masters looked when they were told their work was worth more than they thought. The barbican took 3 weeks to build. 2 walls at an angle in front of the gate, each 15 paces long, as tall as 2 men standing side by side, laid with mortar made of lime and sand. Ingrid's staples every 3 rows. Caden checked every stone, every joint, every staple. The grid burned before his eyes, showing him where corrections were needed. Here, a stone was set crookedly. Here, the mortar is too runny. There, the staple isn't in the right plane. The workers were used to his inspections. They grumbled, but got the job done. They saw that when the prince told them to reposition a stone and they did so, the wall stood stronger. They didn't understand why, but they saw the result. When the barbican was finished, Caden stood in front of the gate and looked at it from the outside. The road to the city no longer led straight toward the gate. It ran up against the barbican wall and turned to the right, then to the left again, and only then toward the gate. 2 turns. Any attacker loses momentum. A battering ram is useless. Cavalry cannot charge straight at the gate at full gallop. Archers from the barbican walls strike those who have entered the corridor from behind. A simple solution, as old as war itself. but no one in Holmgrand had built 24 paces of wall in 50 years to put it into practice. Bran returned from the quarry with the first caravan of stone, 20 wagons. The stone was good, dense, gray limestone from deep layers, not that soft, crumbly material used to build the old walls. Caden examined the stone. The grid flickered approvingly. With proper masonry, this stone will last 100 years. Bran said the quarry was up and running, that he'd left 10 men there, along with 5 soldiers for guard duty, that the road had been cleared but needed repair. Caden nodded. Another line on the map, another item on the list. The list was still growing, but now it was growing more slowly than before, and several items had been crossed off. That evening, Caden climbed up onto the barbican wall. The fresh stone smelled of lime and rain. He placed his palm on the stone. The stone was cold, rough, real. It stood there because people had laid it there, with their own hands, according to his blueprint, but with their own hands. Stone. The stone was cold, rough, real. It stood there because people had laid it with their own hands, according to his blueprint, but with their own hands. The mesh hummed softly. The match rate in the barbican section was 83%, above the threshold. He sensed it before he saw it. The stone beneath his palm grew slightly warmer, slightly denser, as if it had contracted by one invisible fraction. Resonance. The first true resonance in Holmgrand. Caden withdrew his hand. He looked at the stone. Nothing visible had changed, but he knew. The grid knew. This section of the wall now stood not because the stones were heavy. It stood because it was right. Caden stood on the wall and looked down at the city below. Lanterns were lit on the main street. Smoke rose from the chimneys. Somewhere, a hammer was clanging in Ingrid's smithy. She was working late. He thought that back in Mokpo, his boss would have said the project was ahead of schedule on the critical path, but behind on the budget. And he would have been right. The budget was in the red, but the critical path was on track, and the wall stood. Toward the end of the 3rd month, the first refugees arrived in Holmgrand, not those who were fleeing, those who were returning. A family of 5, a husband, a wife, 3 children. They'd left the mark 2 years ago when the Kalthar patrols started coming every week. They'd been living in the west, in a camp by the road, sleeping under a wagon. The children were sick. Then the husband heard from a merchant that Holmgrand had a new owner, that he was building things, that the market was open, that there were street lights. The husband didn't believe it, but the wife said it couldn't be worse than living under a wagon. They arrived in the morning. They stopped at the gate. They saw the barbican, new stone, smooth cobblestones, street lights. The husband stood and looked. The wife held the youngest in her arms and looked too. The older boy, about 10 years old, was the first to walk through the gate. He walked down the street. He touched the stone pavement with his hand. He turned to his parents and said the stone was warm. Caden stood at the tower window and watched them. The grid showed the markings. Husband, carpenter, skilled with his hands. His back is worn out. Wife, weaver, exhausted to the limit. Eldest son, healthy, curious, afraid of the dark. He went down to meet them. He walked out through the fortress gate. He approached. The husband saw his doublet and bowed low. Too low, like a man who's used to keeping his distance from people in fine clothes. Caden told him to stand up, asked where they were from, asked what he could do. The husband said he was a carpenter, that he'd worked at the shipyard by the river before he left. Caden said he needed a carpenter, that there was work, that they'd be provided housing, that they'd figure out what to do with the children. The husband looked at him, unable to comprehend. He was waiting for the terms, waiting for the price, waiting for the catch. Caden said there was only one condition, to work honestly, to build according to the blueprints. If he didn't understand the blueprints, to ask instead of winging it. The husband nodded. His name was Torvald. His wife's name was Elsa. Caden wrote down their names, not in the ledger, but on his map of the city, on the plot where they would live. A name on the map, like a promise. Mila had assigned them a house in the lower quarter. The house was empty. The roof was leaking. The walls were still standing, but the windows were boarded up. Caden returned to the house an hour later with Torvald. He inspected the roof. He pointed out where it was leaking. He said that a beam was rotten in 2 places and needed to be replaced. Torvald looked at the beam. He said he'd replace it himself if they gave him some wood. Caden gave him the wood. Torvald worked for 2 days. He replaced the beam, patched the roof, and put in the shutters. When the fire was lit in the stove for the first time that evening, Elsa stood in the middle of the room and cried, silently, without a sound. She just stood there, tears streaming down her face. Her youngest son slept in her arms and didn't wake up. After the first family came the second, then the third. By the end of the 3rd month, 23 people had returned to Holmgrand. Not many, but every one counted. Among them were 2 masons, 1 cooper, 1 tanner. Caden greeted each one personally. He wrote down their names. He pointed out their location on the map. He gave them work on the very first day. Mila kept track of everything. Her ledger had doubled in size. Now it contained more than just inventory and expenses. It contained people, names, skills, needs. She started a separate page for each family. Caden saw this and said she was smarter than he'd thought. Mila blushed and buried her face in the book. Ulbricht watched. He was still smiling, but his eyes had grown even colder. His daughter was slipping away from him. The city was slipping away from him. New people were coming and registering not with him, but with his daughter at the fortress. His network of petty theft was cracking. He used to control every sack of grain. Now Mila knew the exact figures. Every sack was accounted for. Every expense was recorded. Ulbricht could no longer skim off 3% unnoticed. He began to act. Quietly. As best he could. Through intermediaries. Through rumors. Talk began to spread among the townspeople that the prince was building something for himself, that he would take the houses once construction was complete, that it was a trap, that he would leave for the capital in a year and Holmgrand would be left in debt, that this had already happened under the old Margrave, that there's no such thing as a free lunch. Caden heard these rumors through Bran. Bran relayed them with a frown. He said that people were beginning to have doubts. Caden wasn't surprised. He knew this would happen. In every project, there comes a moment when the initial enthusiasm fades and questions begin to arise. In Mokpo, it happened in the 4th month. Here, it happened a little sooner. Because the people here had suffered more, and it was harder for them to trust. He didn't try to dispel the rumors with words. He did something else. The next day, he went out to the market square. He spread a large sheet of paper on the counter, a map of the lower quarter. 12 houses, each with a name. And next to each name, he wrote a single word. Ownership. Torvald and Elsa's house. Ownership. Old man Jorg's house. Property. Helma the widow's house. Property. People came up and looked. They read. They found their names. Not everyone could read. Those who could read aloud for the others. Caden stood nearby and waited. Torvald was the first to approach. He looked at his name, then at Caden. He asked if it was true, if the house was his, for real, forever. Caden said it was true, that the document would bear the county seal, that the house was being passed down as an inheritance, that no one would take it away. Torvald stood there in silence. His hands, the large, rough hands of a carpenter, were trembling. He had never owned a house in his life. He'd spent his whole life in other people's homes, worked on other people's construction sites, slept under other people's roofs. And now this young prince was telling him that the house was his, by name, forever. Ulbricht stood in the crowd. His face was expressionless, but Caden saw his fingers clench the hem of his cloak. The prince had just knocked the main lever out from under him. Before, everything in the city had been held in temporary use. People lived in houses but didn't own them. The Margrave owned them, or the mayor on his behalf. That gave power. Now that power was slipping away. That evening, Mila came to see Caden in the tower, quietly, as always. She sat down on a chair, placed a book on her lap, and said that her father would be coming tomorrow, that he was angry, that she'd heard him talking to someone last night. She didn't know who, but she'd heard the word capital. Caden looked at her. She sat up straight. Her glasses reflected the candlelight. She didn't lower her gaze. A month ago, she wouldn't have come. A month ago, she would have kept quiet. Caden thanked her. She nodded. She stood up. She left. He was left alone. He looked at the city blueprint, at the names, at the lines, at the plan for the wall he hadn't even started building yet. Ulbricht sent letters to the capital. Gustav sent denunciations to the temple. The Caltharites watched from the border. 3 directions of threat. 3 clockworks ticking simultaneously. Caden picked up a pencil and returned to the blueprint of the northern wall. He couldn't stop the clocks, but he could build the wall before they struck. The 4th month began with rain. It rained for 7 days straight. The river rose. The southern ravine, where the entire drainage system emptied, filled with water. On the 2nd day, the water flowed back. The ditches overflowed. The fortress courtyard was once again covered in puddles. Caden stood in the rain and watched. The grid revealed the problem. The ravine wasn't deep enough. It could handle normal rains, but not prolonged ones. A second outlet was needed, a backup channel, or a settling pond, or both. He worked all night, sketching by candlelight. By morning, he had a plan. A pond behind the southern wall. Not a large one, 20 paces long, 10 paces wide, as deep as a man is tall. A ditch from the ravine to the pond. An overflow from the pond into the river. The system would close the loop, and the rainwater would flow into the river instead of back into the city. The problem was that it was impossible to dig a pond in the rain. The soil turns to mush, the walls collapse, people get soaked and sick. He waited. He waited 3 days for the rain to let up. On the 4th day, the downpour turned into a drizzle. On the 5th, the sky cleared. On the 6th, the sun came out. Caden led the men out at that very hour, 30 men with shovels. Bran assigned 10 soldiers to help. They dug for 3 days. The soil was heavy, clayey. The shovels got stuck. But Caden had calculated correctly. The clay was an advantage. It held the water. The pond's walls didn't need to be reinforced. The clay itself acted as a waterproof barrier. When the pond was ready, he dug a ditch from the ravine and opened the passage. Water gushed into the pond. It filled up in a day. The overflow into the river began working by evening. The system was complete. Caden stood at the edge of the pond and watched. The water was murky from the clay, but it was flowing where it needed to. Bran stood nearby. He said the pond could be used for fish. Caden looked at him. He smiled. He said that Bran was thinking like an urban planner. Bran didn't know what an urban planner was, but he knew that fish in the pond meant food for the garrison, and food for the garrison meant fewer expenses from the dwindling treasury. Caden added a fish pond to the plan. Another item on the list. But this time, it was an item that didn't require money. It actually brought in money. The fish grew on their own. All they had to do was stock it with fry. Torvald found fry in the river backwaters in half a day. Mila recorded the pond in the ledger. She started a new section, food supply. Caden watched her work and thought that in a year, she would be managing the finances of the entire Margraviate, if the Margraviate survived another year. At the end of the 6th week of the 4th month, Soyon Park. Caden found her at the market. Small, thin, dark hair pulled back into a bun, alert eyes, very alert. She was crouching at the edge of a counter, sketching a route for a merchant on a piece of leather. The merchant stood over her, dictating place names. She was drawing from memory. No map, no clues, just from memory. Caden stopped and watched. The grid showed a marker, a refugee from the Far East, a cartographer, the sole survivor of the monastery school, carrying a charred scroll, an unfinished map of her homeland. He waited until the merchant left. He approached, crouched down beside her, looked at the drawing. The route was precise. The scale was accurate. The proportions were correct. She drew like someone who had been taught to see the land from above. Caden asked where she was from. Soyon looked at him. She noticed his doublet. She tensed up. She answered briefly, with an accent he hadn't heard among the locals. From the east, from lands that no longer exist. Caden said he needed someone who could see the land from above. Soyon remained silent. He said they would start with Valenbrook, that he needed a map of the Margraviate, a real one, with topography, roads and rivers, with villages, with quarries, with forests, with everything. Soyon asked why. Caden said, "You can't build what you can't see, that a map is the eyes of a city, that without a map, he's blind." Soyon was silent for a long time. Then she quietly asked what would happen next, after Valenbrook. Caden looked at her. He realized she wasn't asking about the work. She was asking about her map, about that charred scroll she carried with her, about the unfinished work of the teacher who had died. He said that next would be her homeland, that they would restore it to paper, and then they'd see. Soyon didn't cry. She pressed her lips together so tightly they turned white. Then she nodded. Once, briefly, like someone making a decision on which everything depends. Caden brought her to the fortress. He gave her a room next to his own. He gave her paper, good paper, the kind brought by the last caravan from the west. He gave her ink. He gave her charcoal pencils. Soyon unfolded the sheet on the table and smoothed it out with her palms. She looked at the white surface and began to draw. She worked for a full day without a break. Caden peeked in on her 12 hours later. She didn't notice him. She was in that state of concentration he knew from his own experience, when the world disappears and only a line remains, only a map. Just the land you're putting down on paper. He set a mug of water and a plate of bread next to her and left. A day later, Soyon brought him the map of Valenbrook, the first real map of the mark in decades. Caden unfolded it on the floor. Bran crouched down beside him. They looked at it. The mark was larger than Caden had thought. 6 villages, 3 of them empty, abandoned. 2 half-empty, 1 still alive. The village of Typhen in the southwest. 3 bridges, 1 intact, 2 destroyed. An old road to the east, rutted, overgrown, but passable. A river, a quarry, a forest. Hills to the north, a plain to the south. And the thin dotted lines that Soyon had drawn, the routes of the Kalthar patrols. She knew them. She'd seen them when she lived alone in the forest. She'd watched and memorized them. Because a cartographer memorizes routes just as a blacksmith memorizes the temperature of metal. Caden looked at the map and saw the brand. The whole thing, in its entirety, for the first time. And the grid before his eyes overlaid Soyon's map and showed him what he had until then seen only in fragments, lines. The perfect lines of the entire map. Roads, bridges, villages, fields, fortifications. Everything that should be here. Everything that could be here, if it were built. If people wanted it. He looked up. He looked at Soyan. She was standing by the wall, waiting. Quiet, on edge, ready for her work to be criticized. Caden said the map was perfect. Soyan blinked. She clearly hadn't expected that word. He said he needed another one. A map of what the territory would look like in 2 years. If they built everything he planned. Soyan stepped closer. She looked at his blueprints spread out on the floor around the map, the plans for the walls, the water supply system, and the roads. She began to understand. This man wasn't just building a fortress. He was building everything. The entire mark, every road, every bridge, every village. He had a plan for every stone, and he needed her eye to see it from above. She quietly said she would do it. Caden nodded. He looked at the map again, at the dotted lines of the Kalthar routes. They ran through the mark in 3 directions, through abandoned villages, across ruined bridges, along the old highway. The Kaltharians roamed here as if on their own land, and no one stopped them. Yet. Caden traced one of the routes with his finger, the one closest to Holmgrand. 20 versts, half a day's ride. Bran saw his finger, saw his face. He said what they were both thinking, that they would come. Not scouts, the real thing. The only question was when. They arrived in the 6th month. Not an army, a reconnaissance unit. 40 horsemen under the banner bearing Kalthar's silver hammer. They appeared at dawn on the hill northeast of Holmgrand. Bran woke Caden by knocking on the door. Caden got dressed in a minute and climbed onto the wall. The morning light was gray. Fog lay in the lowlands. The horsemen stood on the hill and looked at the city. Caden looked at them. The grid activated instantly. He saw more than just horsemen. He saw their formation. 2 lines of 20. Light cavalry, short lances, round shields, compound bows. The commander at the front. His horse was larger than the rest. A standard. They didn't attack. They stood and watched. Caden understood. They had come to assess the situation, to see the new walls, to see the barbican, to understand what they'd be up against when they came for real. Bran stood beside him. His hand rested on the hilt of his sword. 35 soldiers stood on the walls, 12 archers. Caden told Bran not to shoot. Bran looked at him. Caden repeated himself. Don't shoot. Let them look. Let them see the walls. Let them see the barbican. Let them see that the gates are closed, completely closed. For the first time in years, the gates were shut tight. Ingrid had repaired the hinges last week. The Kaltharians stood on the hill for 2 hours. Then the commander sent 3 of them forward. They rode up to within arrow's range. They stopped. They looked at the barbican, at the new masonry, at the archers on the walls. One of them said something to the other. Then they turned around and galloped back to their unit. 10 minutes later, the entire unit left the hill and headed northeast. Bran exhaled. Caden didn't. He was counting. 40 horsemen meant a reconnaissance party. The main force would follow the scouts. When? Not now. The northern pass would be closed by snow in 2 months. The Kaltharian army wouldn't cross the pass in winter. So, spring. He had 6 months, maybe 7. He climbed down from the wall and went into the tower. He spread the map of Soyan on the floor. He sat down beside it. He thought. A grid glowed before his eyes, showing the city from above. Every wall, every corner, every spot where an archer could be positioned, every passage through which a retreat was possible, every place where the enemy would be vulnerable. He wasn't a military man. Kyle Khan had never served in the army, but he had been designing cities for 20 years. He knew about flows, flows of people, flows of traffic, flows of water, flows of goods. An army is also a flow. It moves along roads, it enters through gates, it flows through the streets. And like any flow, it can be directed, slowed down, divided, stopped. A city is not a fortress. A city is a system of channels through which everything moves: water, people, goods, and soldiers. Whoever controls the channels controls the flow. Caden began to sketch, not a reconstruction plan, a defense plan. The northern wall, a new one, the one he began building last month. It must be ready by spring. A double wall. The outer wall made of gray limestone from the quarries. The inner wall is the old one. Between them, a passage 4 paces wide, narrow, dark, deadly to anyone who enters. The gates. The barbican is already standing, but a second line of defense is needed: the inner gates. If the outer gates are breached, the attackers will enter the barbican. If they get past the barbican, they'll run into the inner gates. 2 locks, 2 keys, 2 walls. The eastern side. Here, the approach is gentle. This is where siege engines will be positioned, so a moat is needed here. A water moat, 10 paces wide and as deep as a man is tall. Water from the river. An intake channel. An overflow channel. A settling pond already exists. The system needs to be expanded. South side. A ravine, a natural obstacle. Deepen it, widen it, reinforce the slopes with stone. West side. A cliff. They won't get through here. The wall stands on a rocky foundation. It's enough to repair the top and set up firing positions. He worked until evening. Then he called Bran. He showed him the plan. Bran looked at it for a long time. He traced the lines with his finger. Caden explained each element. Bran listened. Then he looked up and said the plan was good. That he'd seen fortresses in his 32 years of service, and that none had been designed like this, but that it would require people, stone, and time, and that all of that wasn't enough. Caden said he knew. That's why he wouldn't build everything. He would build only what was necessary: the northern wall, the moat to the east, the inner gate. 3 elements, 6 months. Bran asked how many people. Caden said 50 on the wall, 20 on the moat, 10 on the gates. Bran asked where they would find 80 workers. There were 400 people in the city. Of those, 100 were able-bodied men. Half were already working on the construction site, at the market, and in the quarry. Caden said they needed people from the villages, from the ones that were still alive, from Typhon in the southwest. Bran said that the people of Typhon don't trust Holmgrand, that the old Margrave used to take their people to work and didn't pay them, that they wouldn't come. Caden said he wasn't the old Margrave, that he would go to Typhon himself, that he would show the people the plan, that he'd offer work in exchange for pay and food, and that he needed someone who was known and trusted in Typhon. Bran fell silent. Then he said there was one person, Helga Valenbrook, the late Margrave's niece. She grew up in Typhon. People there remember her. Caden paused. He'd heard that name before. Helga Valenbrook, the half-legitimate heiress to the Margraviate, the woman who'd been pushed aside when he was sent there. Bran said that Helga commands what remains of the old Margrave's retinue, 40 men. They're camped 15 versts south of Holmgrand. They don't recognize Caden. They won't obey him. They won't come. Helga is waiting. For what, exactly, Bran didn't know. Maybe she's waiting for the prince to leave or die. Maybe she's just waiting, Caden thought. He could have ignored Helga, built the walls without her, found people in the villages on his own. But the grid showed him the marks of people in the city, And among those marks were those who remembered Helga Wallenbrook, who respected her, who were waiting for her return. She was part of this land, part of the Margraviate, like a river, like a rock, like the ravine beyond the southern wall. He couldn't build a city while ignoring the river. He couldn't build the Margraviate while ignoring Helga. In the morning, he told Bran that he was going to see Helga. Bran said it was a bad idea, that Helga was sharp-tongued, that she might not accept him, that her people might be hostile. Caden said he'd go, alone, without an escort. Bran said that was a very bad idea. Caden looked at him and said he would go alone because if he arrived with soldiers, it would look like a threat, and he needed a conversation. Bran said nothing. But in the morning, a saddled horse stood at the gate, and Bran stood next to it. He said that if the prince wanted to go alone, he should at least ride a good horse. Caden mounted the saddle. Kyle Khan had never ridden a horse before. Caden Valesk Averlan had learned as a child but hated it. The compromise between the two memories looked awkward. He stayed in the saddle, but without grace. Bran watched him ride out of the gate and shook his head. Helgi Wallenbrook's camp stood in a forest clearing by a stream. 40 men, tents made of worn leather, horses tied up, campfires, the smell of smoke and horse sweat. Caden dismounted at the edge of the clearing. They spotted him immediately. 2 guards came out to meet him, their hands on the hilts of their swords. One asked who he was. Caden gave his name. The guards exchanged glances. One went back into the camp. The other stayed and looked at Caden in silence, without hostility, but without respect either. 5 minutes later, a woman emerged from behind the tents. She was tall, straight back, dark hair cut short, a short bow slung over her shoulder. Travel clothes, worn but clean. Tired eyes. Very tired. The scanner showed a match. Helga Wallenbrook, 28 years old. She'd held the fort alone for 5 years. She'd buried her uncle. She'd buried her hope. She's still here. Helga stopped 10 paces away. She crossed her arms. She looked down at him. She was half a head taller. Caden stood and waited. Helga said she was surprised. She'd been expecting a messenger or an order, not the prince himself, and certainly not just one. Caden said he wasn't going to give her any orders. Helga raised an eyebrow. She asked why he'd come then. Caden asked for a place to sit and spread out a map. Helga hesitated. Then she nodded. They sat down by the fire. Caden unfolded the map of Soyan. When Helga saw the map, her expression changed. She recognized her homeland, every hill, every bend in the river, every village. Her finger traced the map and stopped at Typhen, the village where she'd grown up, where her parents were buried. Caden saw her fingers tremble for a single second. Then she withdrew her hand and looked at him, harshly. She asked what he wanted. Caden showed her the plan to rebuild Typhen. He'd drawn it up 3 nights ago. The village, 20 houses, a well, the road to Holmgrand, a bridge over the stream, a palisade around the perimeter, drainage. He placed the plan next to the map and said he needed her militia to provide cover for the builders while they worked in Typhen, and that he needed her to do it, not him, because the people of Typhen wouldn't follow him. They would follow her. Helga stared at the plan, silently, for a long time. Caden watched her study the drawing, not like a soldier, like someone who had grown up on this land and knew every stone. She found the spot where her parents' house had stood. On the plan, there was a new house there, and next to it was a name, Helga Wallenbrook's house. She looked up. There was something both fiery and angry in her eyes. She asked why he was doing this, why he was putting her name on it, why he was drawing a house that didn't exist. Why was he pretending to care about Typhen and about her? Caden answered simply. He said he wasn't taking the title away from her, that the title was hers, that he was an architect, not the owner, that he needed someone whom the people of this land trusted, and that she was that person. Helga was silent. The warriors around the campfire were silent. The stream murmured. The horses snorted. Then Helga said that he was either the smartest person she'd ever met or the most dangerous. Caden said he was an engineer. Helga didn't understand the word, but she understood the tone, and she realized that the prince was sitting alone by her campfire, without guards, without weapons, with a map bearing her name. She said she'd think about it. Caden nodded. He stood up. He rolled up the map. He left the plan of Typhen behind. He mounted his horse. He rode away. 3 days later, Helga Valenbrook led her retinue to the gates of Holmgrand. 40 horsemen. She rode into the Barbican. She saw the new masonry. She saw Ingrid's staples. She saw the cobblestone street. She saw the street lights. She saw the market with its awnings. She stopped her horse in the middle of the square. She looked around. Then she told one of her men that the prince hadn't lied, that the city was alive. Caden met her at the fortress. He introduced Bran. He introduced Mila. He introduced Ingrid. Ingrid and Helga looked at each other, and something clicked between them. Two women who'd held on by sheer stubbornness in a place where everything was falling apart. They understood each other in a single second. Ingrid said that the horseshoes on the women's horses were no good. Helga replied that it wasn't her fault, but the fault of a world that lacked a proper blacksmith. Ingrid snorted and said that now there was one. Caden stood nearby and listened. For the first time in half a year, he felt something resembling a team. Not just people working for him, people working with each other. Bran and his soldiers, Mila and her numbers, Ingrid and her steel, Soyan and her maps, and now Helga and her retinue. 5 people, 5 directions, 5 parts of a single mechanism. He didn't say this out loud. He simply unfolded the defense plan in front of Helga. He pointed to the northern wall, the moat to the east, the inner gates. Helga listened. Then she said the plan was good. But he'd forgotten one thing. He'd forgotten the people outside the walls. Typhen, villages, farmsteads. If the Caltharian army came, these people would be the first to be killed. Caden said he knew. That's why he needed her. To organize the evacuation, retreat routes, assembly points, signal fires. Helga nodded. She knew this land. Every trail, every ford, every cave. She could lead people to Holmgrand even at night, even in a blizzard. The work began the next day. Helga's band set out for Typhen. 10 builders went with them. Torvald led them. He took Ingrid's tools, planks, and staples. Caden gave him the blueprints for the first 5 houses. Simple, sturdy, with the proper roof pitch, with drainage around the foundation. Torvald looked at the blueprints and said he would build them. Caden trusted him. Everyone else remained in Holmgrand. 50 men on the northern wall, 20 at the rampart, 10 at the inner gates. Caden worked alongside them, every day. His hands had long since stopped hurting from blisters. His skin had toughened. His shoulders had broadened. He was no longer a boy prince. He wasn't quite a warrior yet. He was a builder. And the city grew along with him. Winter came early. In the 2nd week of the 8th month, the first snow fell and never melted. 2/3 of the northern wall was complete. The moat had been dug but not yet filled in. The inner gates stood. Ingrid had cast hinges for them from steel so strong that when Bran tried to cut through one with his sword, the blade became dull. Caden worked 12 hours a day. He drew plans at night. He slept 4 hours. Mila brought him food because he forgot to eat. She would set the plate on the floor next to the drawings and leave silently. Sometimes he would find the plate empty and couldn't remember eating. In the 8th month, Isla arrived in Holmgrand. It happened at night. Bran woke Caden and said that the guards had detained a person in the basement of the fortress's old library. Caden went downstairs. In the basement, by the light of a single candle, stood a slender, fair-haired woman in a traveling cloak. The cloak was a temple cloak, with a silver border from the Temple of Measure. But the border had been cut off, roughly, with a knife. On the woman's left forearm was a tattooed symbol of the Temple of Measure, the mark of an initiate. The net flashed before Caden's eyes more brightly than usual. The mark on this woman was different from the others. It was deeper, more complex. A temple architect, the highest circle. She reads the celestial net. She knows the language of ancient blueprints. She has fled. She is afraid. Caden looked at her. She was looking at him. Her eyes were red from sleeplessness and tears, but dry now. She was waiting for him to order her arrest, or to expel her, or to send her back to the temple. Caden did none of those things. He walked over to the table by the wall where the library's old scrolls lay. He picked up his sketch of the northern quarter. He placed it in front of her, and said that he thought he might have made a mistake somewhere in the angles on the northern side. That he sensed a mistake but couldn't see it. He asked her to check it. Isla looked at the drawing, then at him, then back at the drawing. Her hands were shaking as she picked up the sheet. She held it up to the candle. Her eyes moved along the lines, quickly, precisely, like the eyes of someone who had been reading blueprints since the age of 7. She found the mistake in 10 seconds. The angle of the northeast turn was 3 degrees wider than it should be. Under wind load, this angle would cause a crack within 5 years. She said this in an even voice. Professional. Then she fell silent. Then her face broke and she began to cry. Not loudly, quietly. Like someone who had been treated as a tool for 15 years and, for the first time in 15 years, was being spoken to as a master. Caden waited. When she calmed down, he asked why she was there. Isla explained. The Temple of Measure had decided to close Holmgrand, to declare everything Caden had built heresy, to send an inspection team, and if Caden refused to tear down what he'd built, the temple would ask the crown to intervene. Isla had been chosen as the executor. She was supposed to come to Holmgrand and perform the ritual of severance, to cut the city off from the celestial network, to turn the stones to dust, the walls to rubble. Forever. She refused. She cut the trim off her cloak, and she fled. Because she had seen Caden's blueprints. Gustav had been sending copies to the temple, and in those blueprints, Isla saw what no one in the temple had seen. The lines coincided with the network, not according to ritual, not by blessing, by mathematics, by precision, by measure. This young prince, whom the temple called a heretic, was doing what the temple had been doing for 2,000 years, only better. Without rituals, without prayers, without a monopoly. Just right. And if the temple destroys his work, it will destroy the proof that measure belongs not to the priests, but to those who build. Caden listened. When she finished, he asked what the first knot was. Isla froze. She asked how he knew that word. Caden said he didn't know, that he had felt a hum in the fortress's basement, deep below, like a vibration in his bones, that the grid before his eyes grew brighter as he descended deeper. Isla sat down on the stone floor, slowly, like someone whose legs had given way. She said that the first knot was a legend of the temple, the oldest, the most forbidden. The point where the celestial grid began. 2,000 years ago, the Temple of Measure found this knot and sealed it away. Because whoever controls the knot has no need for the temple. She said that, according to legend, the knot lies beneath a city that has died. Caden said the city hadn't died. The city is sick, but he's healing it. Isla looked up at him. Her eyes held both fear and admiration. She said that if the knot were to awaken, the temple wouldn't come here for an inspection. It would come with an army. Caden remained silent. He knew. Another time bomb, another threat, but also another opportunity. He held out his hand to Isla, helped her to her feet, told her they'd give her a room and a job, that she'd check every one of his drawings, every corner, every line, that he makes mistakes and will continue to make them because he didn't study here or the way they do, and that he needed someone who knew the grid better than he did. Isla took his hand. Her fingers were cold, slender, with ink stains on the tips. She said she would stay. From that day on, Caden didn't build alone. Isla checked every one of his calculations, corrected the angles. She pointed out where the grid was stronger, where it was weaker, where a stone would resonate, where it wouldn't. Their work at night looked strange. 2 people on the floor of the tower, blueprints scattered around, candles, whispered voices, arguments over degrees and wall thickness. Mila brought them both food. Ingrid brought new samples of staples. Soyan brought updated maps. And Helga sent messengers from Typhen with reports on construction and Kalthar movements. The city was preparing for winter. And the city was preparing for war. Winter dragged on. Caden didn't halt construction for a single day. The snow got in the way. The frost made the stone brittle. The mortar didn't set well. But they kept working. Isla showed him a technique they knew at the temple. If you lay the stone at a specific mortar temperature and in the correct sequence, the resonance begins to work faster. The stone becomes denser. The mortar hardens not because of the cold, but because of the correct alignment. They tested it on a section of the north wall. It worked. Caden watched this and thought that in Seoul, not a single engineer would have believed him, that the mortar hardens because the wall is built correctly. But here, it was physics, a different kind of physics. By midwinter, the north wall was finished, 200 paces of double wall. The outer wall was made of gray limestone on Ingrid's steel brackets. The inner wall was old. Between them was a passage 4 paces wide. Caden walked through this passage from one end to the other. The walls closed in overhead. It was narrow, dark, a loophole every 20 paces, a staircase leading upward every 40 paces. Anyone who entered here would find themselves in a stone sack under crossfire. It wasn't elegant. It was effective. The moat to the east was filled with water at the beginning of the 3rd month of winter. The canal from the river was working. The water took a day. 10 paces wide, as deep as a man is tall. Caden ordered sharp stones and scrap iron to be scattered across the bottom. You can't see it from above, but anyone who tries to wade across the moat will find out. The inner gate stood firm, heavy oak doors on steel hinges. Ingrid had spent 3 days forging the bolt. The bolt was so sturdy that Bran said it would be easier to tear down the wall next to it than to break the bolt out. By the end of winter, Caden had gathered everyone together, in the fortress, in the evening. Bran, Mila, Ingrid, Soyan, Helga, Isla. He spread out a full-scale map on the floor, a map of Soyan with the defense plan overlaid on it. Every element, every wall, every moat, every turn, every embrasure, every retreat point, every signal fire. He went over the plan from start to finish. He explained the logic. If the enemy approaches from the north, they'll run into a double wall. If they bypass it to the east, they'll fall into the moat. If they try from the south, there's a ravine and fortified slopes. The west is a cliff. The only way into the city is through the gates, through the Barbican, through the inner gates. 2 turns, 2 locks, 2 lines of defense, and between those lines were Helga's archers and Bran's soldiers. Helga listened and nodded. Bran listened and remained silent. Ingrid listened and calculated how many arrows they'd need. Soyan listened and made notes on the map. Mila listened and counted their supplies. Isla listened and checked the network lines on the map. When Caden finished, there was silence. Then Helga said she'd seen fortresses, that she'd served under her uncle, that she'd traveled along the border, but she'd never seen a city designed as a weapon. Caden said that a city isn't a weapon. A city is a home, but a good home protects those who live in it. Helga looked at him for a long time. Then she smiled quietly and turned away. But Caden noticed. That smile was different. Not ironic. Warm. The next day, Caden did what he'd been planning since the first month. He gathered the city. Everyone. Not just soldiers. Everyone. Artisans, children, the elderly, refugees, merchants, carpenters, bricklayers. In the square, in the evening. The streetlights were lit. Snow lay on the cobblestones, but the cobblestones were clean, because Caden had calculated the slope so that the snow would melt on its own. People stood and waited. Caden stepped out into the middle of the square. He didn't give a speech. He unfurled a huge sheet across the cobblestones. A map of Holmgren's future. 5 years from now. A city. A real city. Double walls around the entire perimeter. A moat. A water supply system. 3 warehouses. A school. A blacksmith's workshop. A market square with stone arcades. Streets paved from end to end. Streetlights at every intersection. Houses. Dozens of houses. And on every house, a name. Not a title, not a social class, a name. Ingrid Halden's house, Mila Olbricht's house, Torvald and Elsa's house, Old Man Jorg's house, Widow Helma's house, Soyon Park's house. Even the empty lots were labeled. This will be the home of a family that hasn't arrived yet, but will. People looked. They found their names. They read them aloud for those who couldn't. They whispered. They were silent. They cried. Caden said one sentence. He said he couldn't promise that they would win, but he could promise that if they did win, this would be theirs, by name. Silence. Wind, snow, the light of the lanterns on their faces. And old Captain Bran. 32 years of service, 3 Margraves, hundreds buried. He slowly and heavily dropped to one knee, not before the prince, before the architect who had inscribed his name into the city. Behind him, Torvald knelt. Behind Torvald, Ingrid. She knelt and, in a deep voice, said that if the prince thought she would stand there for long, he was mistaken, because she had plenty to do. Caden looked at them, at his people, at his city. The grid glowed gold, and he felt something deep below. Beneath the square, beneath the foundation, beneath the stone. A hum. Stronger than before. The first knot was breathing. Spring had come with an army. The Caltharites crossed the pass as soon as the snow melted. 12,000 men. 3 siege towers. 2 imperial battle mages, and among them, men without banners. Mercenaries. Caden would have recognized their insignia if he'd seen them, but he hadn't. Helga had seen them. She had rushed in from the outpost the day before the army arrived. She entered the tower, drenched in sweat, and said that among the Caltharites were men of the elder prince, Gareth. She had recognized the crest on the lining of one of the commander's cloaks, the golden lion of Orilon with a crossed-out crown. Gareth's personal emblem. Caden was sitting on the floor, blueprints all around him, candles, a map. He listened and wasn't surprised. He knew Gareth would come. Not in person, through others, through gold, through an alliance with the enemy to eliminate his brother. It was politics. Dirty, ordinary, predictable. Caden stood up. He rolled up the blueprints. He went down to the courtyard. He gathered the council: Bran, Helga, Ingrid, Mila, Soyan, Isla. They stood around a table with a model of the city. Caden had made the model that winter. Wood and clay. Every wall, every tower, every moat, every house. He placed the tokens. Red for the enemy, blue for his own. 12,000 red against 300 blue. Bran said what everyone was thinking, that this wasn't a battle. It was an execution. Caden said no, that an execution is when the executioner controls the space. Here, he controlled the space. Every stone, every turn, every corner, every loophole. He'd been building this city for a year and a half. He'd built it for this day. Not for beauty, for survival. He began to explain. The enemy would approach from the north. They'd run into the double wall. They'd try to go around it. To the east, a moat. To the south, a ravine. To the west, a cliff. The only way in was through the gate, the barbican, 2 turns, the inner gate. But the enemy knows this. They'll try something else. Siege towers, ladders, a battering ram. Caden had it all figured out. The siege towers will approach the northern wall. The outer wall will take the first blow. It will hold. The resonance has compacted the stone. Ingrid's staples hold the masonry together. Ladders will be set up on the eastern section. The wall is lower there, but there's a moat. The ladders will have to be carried across the moat. That takes time. That means casualties. That means chaos. The battering ram will target the gate. The barbican will stop the first blow. If they break through, they'll enter the corridor. In the corridor, Helga's archers will be firing from above on both sides. Caden ran through every possibility, every scenario, every combination. A grid flashed before his eyes, showing streams of movement, a stream of soldiers, a stream of vehicles, a stream of arrows, like water through canals. He saw where the flow would go, and he prepared the canal walls. Helga listened and nodded. She positioned her men on the map, 40 warriors, archers on the walls, swordsmen at the gates, a cavalry reserve behind the inner gates for a counterattack if they were breached. Bran positioned his soldiers, 35 on the walls, archers in the towers, spearmen in the barbican. Ingrid said she'd forged enough arrows to last a week of battle. Soyan spread out a map of the surrounding area and pointed out escape routes for civilians. 3 routes: into the forest to the southwest, toward Typhen, toward the caves in the hills. Mila was tallying the supplies, enough food for 3 weeks. Water isn't a problem. The well and the water supply are working. Enough arrows for 5 days of continuous firing. Firewood for a month. Isla was silent. Then she said one thing. That resonance doesn't just work on stone. That if the whole city resonates at the same frequency, the arrows fly more accurately. The gates close faster. Water flows where it's needed, exactly when it's needed. But for that to happen, the alignment with the grid has to be perfect, 100%. Caden asked what was needed for that. Isla said that people had to want the city to stand, not because they were ordered to, but genuinely. Caden looked out the window, at the square, at the map with names that was still lying there, dusty with snow. People walked around it. They didn't step on it. They treated it with care. He said that people want it. The army took up position beneath the walls on the 3rd day of spring. 12,000. 3 siege towers, tents stretching from horizon to horizon. Calthar's banners fluttering in the wind. The silver hammer. Caden stood on the wall and watched. The grid showed him everything, every soldier, every weapon, every weak spot in the enemy's formation. The Caltharian commander sent a messenger. He offered surrender, a guarantee of life, honorable captivity for the prince. Caden listened to the messenger and refused. He said one thing, that the city would stand. The messenger left. The next morning, the assault began. 3 weeks. 21 days. They came in waves, by day and by night, from the north, the east, and the south. The siege towers rolled up to the northern wall on the second day. The wall stood firm. The stone hummed under the blows of the battering rams, but did not crumble. It held its resonance. Ingrid's clamps pulled the masonry apart. Ladders were set up on the eastern section. Soldiers climbed down into the moat and cut their legs on the stones at the bottom. Helga's archers fired from above. The moat had become a trap. The battering ram charged the gate on the 5th day. The barbican absorbed the blow. The first gate leaves cracked on the 8th day. The Caltharites burst into the corridor and found themselves trapped in a stone sack. Arrows rained down from above on both sides. Ahead lay the inner gate. Ingrid bolted the gate. Behind them, through the breached gate leaves, their comrades were pressing forward, preventing any retreat. A stampede, screams, death in the narrow stone passageway. Caden stood in the command room, a model on the table, tokens. He moved them and gave orders. He could see, as if through a grid, where the enemy was now, where they would be in an hour. He read the flow just as he had read traffic flows in Seoul. Only here, the flow consisted of living people who wanted to kill his men. On the 14th day, he gave the order he had feared. He told Helga to withdraw her unit from the northern wall. Let them come in. Helga looked at him. There was a question in her eyes. Caden pointed to the model. 200 paces from the wall, the street narrowed. Houses on both sides. The walls converged at a corner. He had built this block in the summer, on purpose. The houses weren't meant for living in. They stood like the walls of a funnel. The enemy would enter. They would spread out along the street. They would run into the narrowing. They would stop. And the Soyen archers would strike from above, from the rooftops, and the gates behind them would close. A trap. He told Helga that he wasn't attacking. He was setting a trap. Helga nodded. On the 15th day, the Caltharites breached a section of the northern wall. 100 soldiers stormed into the city. They ran down the street. They reached the narrowing. They stopped. The walls closed in at the corner. A dead end lay ahead. Arrows rained down from above. Behind them, the gates had slammed shut. A dead end. The 100 surrendered an hour later. No casualties on either side. Caden didn't want to kill anyone. He wanted to stop them. At dawn on the 21st day, they launched a decisive assault. Around the entire perimeter, all at once, with everything they had. 12,000 minus casualties. And the city began to ring. Caden felt it before he heard it. The vibration came from below, from beneath the ground, from beneath the square, from beneath the fortress's foundation, from the place where the first node lay. Every stone resonated, every beam, every cobblestone, every Ingrid bracket, every water pipe, every lamp post. The city sounded like a single instrument. The resonance centered on the node. The walls didn't become invulnerable. They became precise. Arrows flew exactly where they were meant to. The gates closed at exactly the right moment. The storm drain released the water that had been pooling for 3 weeks right at the feet of the siege ladders. Stone did not crumble. Wood did not burn. Water flowed where it was supposed to. The grid before Caden's eyes matched reality. Completely. 100%. The golden lines vanished, because the world and the grid had become one. The army retreated at dawn on the 22nd day. Caden stood on the central tower and watched as 12,000 men marched north. Not a single meter of the wall had been breached. The siege towers stood abandoned at the foot of the northern wall, charred, wet, useless. The wind carried the smell of smoke and wet earth. Isla stood beside Caden. She was silent. Her eyes were wide open. She wasn't looking at the army. She was looking at the walls, at the stone that hummed quietly and steadily, like a calm breath. She said that the first knot no longer sleeps, that it breathes, that it had been waiting 2,000 years for someone who would come to repair, not to plunder. Caden remained silent. He didn't know what to say, because at that moment he finally understood something about himself, about Kyle Hahn, about why he, of all people, had ended up here. The knot hadn't responded to a warrior, not to a mage, not to a saint. It had responded to a man who, at the moment of his death, was thinking about a poorly calculated curve in the embankment, about a man who hadn't finished his work, and on the other side of the world, in another world. The dying Margrave whispered the word, "Fix." And the knot reached across the fabric of worlds and found the one who fit the description. Caden stood on the tower and thought about it, about the waterfront in Mokpo, about the thermos of coffee, about the crosswalk, about the red light that the drunk driver hadn't noticed, about his last thought regarding the slope in the second quarter. He didn't know if he was happy. He knew the city was still standing. Below, the gates opened. People were coming out onto the square, slowly, carefully, as if after an earthquake, looking back, unable to believe that it was quiet, that the walls were intact, that the sky was clear, that no one was shooting. The children ran out first, as always. They ran along the pavement, they touched the walls, they touched the lampposts. One boy pressed his ear against the wall and said that the wall was singing. He was right. The wall was singing, softly, at a frequency only children and those who built it could hear. Bran was the last to step out onto the square. He walked slowly. His left arm was bandaged, an arrow wound on the 9th day. Not deep, but he wasn't getting any younger. He stopped in the middle of the square. He looked up at the tower where Caden stood. Their eyes met. Bran said nothing. He simply nodded, like a man who had waited 32 years for the moment when he would no longer be ashamed of the place where he served. And he had waited for it. Caden descended from the tower. He walked through the fortress courtyard. He stepped out onto the square. People parted to let him through. They watched him. He walked, and the grid before his eyes was silent, not because it had turned off, because it matched. The city around him was right, not perfect, just right. Every stone lay where it should. Every gutter carried water where it needed to go. Every streetlight shone at the calculated distance. Every house stood in the place it was meant to be. And on every house had a name. They were waiting for him in the square. Ingrid stood with her arms crossed, soot on her cheek, her apron scorched. She had been forging arrowheads for all 3 weeks of the siege. Her hands were black from the metal and red from the heat. Mila stood beside her, a book pressed to her chest. She had been counting the supplies every day of the siege. Every morning she brought Caden the exact figures: how many arrows were left, how much food, how much water, how much firewood. Without her, he would have been blind. Soyeon stood slightly to the side, quiet as always. She didn't shoot a bow. She directed the archers, because she knew every corner of every roof. She mapped out their positions. She saw the city from above. And the archers shot where she pointed. Helga dismounted from her horse. Her retinue stood behind her, 40 horsemen, all alive. She had led them through 3 weeks of battle without a single casualty, because she knew when to attack and when to retreat, because she listened to Caden when he said to pull the men back, because she trusted the blueprint. Isla stood by the fortress wall, pale, thin. She hadn't slept for 21 days. She monitored the resonance, every section of the wall, every corner. If a resonance match occurred somewhere, she would go there and fix it. A stone, mortar, a corner, a single line, a single degree. The difference between a standing wall and a collapsed one. She held the city as a musician holds a note. 3 weeks without a break. And then there was the 6th. Renee Castle. Wren. She had arrived in Holmgrand a month before the siege, the daughter of a merchant family from the southern coast, lively, outspoken, in a dress that cost more than the entire contents of Holmgrand's treasury. She brought with her 3 carts of goods, glass for windows, spices, fabrics, and most importantly, a letter from her father, a 5-year contract to supply grain and iron to the Valenbrook Mark. Caden met her at the fortress. She walked in and looked around. She saw blueprints on the floor. She saw maps on the walls. She saw Caden in work clothes with calloused hands. And instead of curtsying, she said she'd imagined a prince differently. Caden unfolded the plan for the new commercial district before her. He showed her what the market would look like in 5 years. The main trading hub on the eastern border, warehouses, courtyards, river docks. And he said that her father wanted a monopoly. That there would be no monopoly, but he was giving her, personally, the market project. To her. Not to her father. To her. Wren looked at the plan, then at Caden, then back at the plan. And for the first time in her life, she fell silent for a full minute. Then she said that the prince was either mad or the only honest person she had ever met, and that in either case, she was staying. She stayed. And when the siege began, she didn't leave. She stayed in the city. She traded in supplies. She kept track of consumption. She distributed food. She argued with suppliers. She bargained with prisoners for information. She did what she did best. She calculated and negotiated. Now she was standing in the square. Her dress was dirty, her hair was disheveled, and she was smiling. Caden stood in the middle of the square and looked at them, at all of them, at the 6 women who had become his team, at Bran, who had become his sword, at Torvald and Elsa and old man Jorg and the widow Helma and everyone else, at the people who had carved their names into the city. Not him, they had. With their own hands, through their own labor, through their choice to stay. Ingrid stepped forward. She wiped the soot from her cheek with the back of her hand, smearing it even more. She looked at Caden and spoke loudly, in a deep voice, so that the whole square could hear, that the house was standing, and that it was time for dinner. Caden looked at her, at the soot on her cheek, at her hands scorched by fire, at her eyes, which held neither fear nor tears, only exhaustion. And through that exhaustion, something warm, something that made his throat tighten. He laughed, for the first time in a year and a half, out loud, not quietly, not just with his lips, for real. The square fell silent. Then Bran laughed, hoarsely. Then Torvald. Then one of the soldiers. Then the children. And within a minute, the whole square was laughing. Not out of joy, out of relief, out of the fact that they were alive, out of the fact that the walls were still standing, because the house was still standing. Caden stood in the middle of his city and laughed, and beneath his feet, deep in the earth, the first knot hummed quietly and steadily, like a heart, like the city's second heart, which had waited 2,000 years and had finally been answered, not by a warrior, not by a king, by an engineer who had come to repair it. That evening they sat in the fortress, all together. Bran poured something strong into mugs. Ingrid brought bread from the smithy because the stove there was the only one that hadn't gone out in 3 weeks. Mila quietly said that their supplies would last until summer. Ren said that a caravan from the south would arrive in a week. Helga said that the guard would take over patrol duty. Soyan laid a new map on the table. A map of the future. Mark Valenbrook in 3 years. 6 villages, all alive. 3 bridges, all intact. Roads, fields, forests. Caden looked at the map, then at Isla. She was sitting in the corner, quiet, tired. She was holding a mug with both hands. He asked her what would happen next with the knot. Isla said it was up to him to decide, that the knot had awakened, that Holmgrand was now the second hub of the network on the continent, equal to the capital, that the Temple of Measure knew this, or would find out soon, that the Crown knew this, or would find out soon, that the world had changed that night, and that Caden would have to decide who he was. A prince who had returned to seek revenge, or the architect of a new country. Caden was silent. He held the mug and stared at the fire in the fireplace. He was thinking. Kyle Hahn of Seoul was thinking about the Mokpo waterfront he never finished building, about the projects left on the drawing board, about the life that ended at a crosswalk. Caden Valesk Avrillon was thinking about the brothers who wanted him dead, about the father who cast him out, about the mother who hadn't come out to say goodbye. 2 people in one body. 2 sets of pain. 2 sets of memories. But one decision. He set the mug down on the table. He looked at the people around him, at Ingrid, who was arguing with Helga about horseshoes, at Mila, who was quietly writing something in a book, at Soyan, who was smoothing out a map with her palms, at Ren, who was telling Bran about southern wines, at Isla, who was staring into the fire and thinking about things only she knew. He spoke quietly so that everyone could hear. He said he wasn't a prince, not an avenger, not a pretender to the throne. He said he was an architect, and that tomorrow morning he would begin work on the water supply system for the new neighborhood. Because in the eastern houses, people still carry water in buckets. And this in a city that had just withstood a siege by an army of 12,000. This is unacceptable. Ingrid turned to him. She looked at him and said quietly that His Highness was incorrigible. Caden nodded. He stood up. He walked over to the window. He looked out at the city. The streetlights were on, all 42 of them on the main street. Not a single one had gone out during the 3-week siege. The cobblestones glistened after the rain. Somewhere in the lower quarter, a light was on in Torvald's house. Elsa was putting the children to bed. The children are alive. The house is still standing. The roof isn't leaking. Caden placed his palm on the stone wall. The stone was warm. It was always warm now. The first knot breathed below and warmed the city from within, like a furnace, like a heart. Caden quietly said what he had told himself on that first day by the crumbling wall, that this could be fixed, that this was simply a poorly designed world, and that the material here was different, but the hands were the same. He stepped away from the window, sat down on the floor, unfolded a blank sheet of paper, picked up a pencil, and began to sketch out the water supply system for the eastern quarter. Behind the wall, the first node hummed quietly. A map with names lay on the square. The streetlights were on. The city stood. And the architect worked.